you're younger than about 40 years of age, you probably don't realize that there was a time when we didn't have cell phones. I don't know if you're aware of the background of cell phones, but it kind of became a reality, at least in testing form, in 1973. An article I looked up says it this way: we didn't always have cell phones, but that changed in 1973. That year, engineer Martin Cooper, and I believe this is a picture of him later in life with the phone that he helped to develop. That year, in 1973, engineer Martin Cooper invented the first truly mobile phone. To celebrate, he used a test model to call a rival engineer while walking down a New York City street. Can't you see an engineer doing that, right? Hi, guess what I'm doing? Anyway, Cooper's phone went on sale in the U.S. in 1984, called the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, and I believe that's what he's holding there. The phone measured more than a foot long. It weighed 1.8 pounds, more than the weight of 5 of the latest iPhones combined. You may recall, I can remember my dad having one of those bag phones, and probably some of you had those as well. Cell phones used to be kind of a cumbersome thing. Early phones were a lot like landline phones. You could just talk. Amazing. There was no texting, no internet access, no games. The battery lasted only about 30 minutes. Over the years, of course, more features became available. In 1993, you could text on some phones. In 1994, a Tetris-like game became the first to appear on a mobile phone. By 1999, you could use some phones to go online. We take that all for granted these days, don't we? But not that long ago, it wasn't a reality. Tech companies started adding cameras to phones in 2002. This paved the way for apps like Instagram. Today, according to this article in March of 2018, today there are more than 7 billion cell phones in use around the world. Incredible, right? And we were just marking the other day, you can see pictures taken from the most remotest part of Africa these days, and guess what? People have a cell phone. So a lot of good, a lot of not so good comes with all of that, but that's kind of the story. And for you youngsters, back in our day, we didn't have all these luxuries, right? Well, in today's lesson, we want to go back to a time long before cell phones. In fact, there's a picture. You know what that is? A dial phone. I grew up with dial phones, right? A long time before there were phones of any kind. But even in those days, people made calls, especially in times of distress in your life. Who are you going to call? We're going to look at 1 Samuel chapters 26 through 30 this morning. And don't worry, we're not going to go verse by verse through 5 chapters. We don't have time for that. But we do need to look at a large section of the Bible's record of David's life to make our point. And so we're just going to kind of summarize the chapters and work our way to what we want to say. We don't want to read it all, but only summarize the various sections. So let's dive in this morning. First of all, in chapter 28, let's back up. We don't need that one yet. Just follow along, or just listen along, if you will. I'm just going to make passing reference to some things in this chapter. Again, you know the story. I think most of you have been here through this whole series of looking at the life of David. At this point in David's life, he's been driven out of the court of Saul. Saul's trying to kill him, chasing him all over Judea to put him to death. We've looked over the last couple of weeks to some examples in the life of David where he had to learn some important lessons about taking his own revenge. So David's still learning, as we all need to do. But in chapter 26 of 1 Samuel, basically what's going on in that chapter is that Saul continues his dogged search for David. The early part of the chapter just talks about where Saul chased David here, and David escaped. Anyway, you can follow that, read it later. There's another encounter that is in many ways like the episode in the cave with chapter 24. chapter 26, David is given another chance to take Saul's life. In that case, it was an active act on the part of David and a couple of his men to sneak into the camp, the very camp of Saul, while he lay asleep. There were supposed to be, of course, men guarding the king. You know, not everybody goes to sleep. But for one reason or another, maybe they didn't think David would ever dare to do something like this. But David sneaked into Saul's camp while he's sleeping. Once again, David is encouraged by his men to kill Saul, right? He's laying there asleep right at your feet. In fact, Saul's spear is right there. This time, even his men volunteered to do it. Last time, they just encouraged David in the cave, you do it. Now this is all right. If you've got qualms about doing it, let us do it. But once again, David refuses to take the life of God's anointed. And as part of that, David takes his spear and his water jug and goes far enough away, and he calls back to Saul, wakes him up. And the dialogue ensues between Saul and David. Like the previous encounter, Saul goes through admitting his guilt and acknowledging that David will ultimately prevail. But if you know the story of 1 Samuel here, this is going to be the last time in chapter 26 when Saul and David see each other in the story. From this point on, their paths diverge a bit. Then in chapter 27 of 1 Samuel, David makes the decision to hide among the Philistines, the dreaded foes of Israel. And again, the text doesn't say one way. Well, I know the text doesn't say God said to do that. Nowhere does the Bible say God told David, you go hide among the Philistines. I'm of the opinion that David made this choice on his own. We could debate whether that was a wise thing. My guess would be that probably the wise thing for David to have done would have been to continue to trust God. God's taken care of him so far in this chess match between the two kings. Anyway, be that as it may, David makes the decision to go hide among the Philistines. And again, they're at this point in history, they're Israel's primary foe. Saul, of course, David reasons, wouldn't dare venture into the heart of Philistine territory to seek him. Again, no indication that he does this in God's prompting. But let me just read one verse from chapter 27, the first verse. Chapter 27, verse 1. Then David said to himself, now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me to do than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Saul will then despair of searching for me any more in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. So that gives you a little insight into what's going through his mind. Maybe he's saying, well, you know what? This is all I have left to do. An uneasy alliance is formed with the Philistines, built, of course, by the deception of David. He goes into the Philistines, and they're hesitant. I mean, they've probably heard about Saul and David one way or the other. They're not so sure. Do we welcome this Israelite with his band of men among us? But David, David kind of works his way into Achish, was the Philistine king, and he works himself into his good graces, and things are going pretty well. He's given the city of Ziklag, David is to live in with his men and their families. And David uses that base among the Philistines to continue attacking the enemies of Israel, ironically, right? Pretending, though, to be leading raids against Israel. So a lot of deception going on, trying to save his neck. Chapter 28. At the beginning of this chapter, we briefly read of David's alliance running into a serious snag. The early verses there in chapter 28, King Achish commands David and his men to go to war with him against Israel. Now, that's a horse of the different colors, we say. David was willing to lead raids against Israel's enemies as long as he didn't have to fight against Israel. But now he's kind of between a rock and a hard place. The king has commanded him to do it. Now, what's David going to do? We'll come back to this part of the story in chapter 29 in just a moment. But in the rest of chapter 28, the writer of 1 Samuel leaves that part of the story in tension as he shifts back to Saul, who's in the midst of his own crisis as well. The Philistines had gathered against Israel, and things didn't look good at all. Samuel, the prophet, was dead, so Saul isn't going to get any advice from him anymore. The Lord, the Bible tells us, himself had stopped answering inquiries as well. That's chapter 28, verse 6. So guess where Saul turns? To sorcery, or the occult. He says, I need answers. And a woman, who's referred to as the medium at Endor, calls up the spirit of Samuel. It's kind of a humorous story in itself as well. You can read that later today in chapter 28. The Endor, the medium at Endor is surprised by her success, calling back Samuel. The prophet turns out to be no help for Saul, though, right? Saul, in essence, Samuel asks, why ask me, Saul, about your troubles, since God has abandoned you? So Saul, at this point in his reign, is truly alone in the midst of his crisis. If you've ever been in the midst of your own crisis alone, that's a terrible place to be. Now we move into chapter 30, or 29 rather. Let's go back to David's part of the story. David has been called to go to war with the Philistines against Israel. How is he going to get out of this crisis? Well, help arises for David when other Philistine leaders have some serious problems with the Israelites in their midst as they attack Israel. Think about it, right? What a perfect scenario. Achish, the king, is so smitten with David, he says, oh, he's going to go to war with us. And these other Philistine leaders say, what? We're going to go to fight Israel, and we're going to have a group of 400 to 600 men of Israelites in the midst of us? That's not going to go anywhere good. How can that be a good idea? Well, they go back and forth, Achish between his soldiers, and finally David and his men are allowed to leave and go home. Well, problem solved, right? Not necessarily. In fact, in chapter 30, if you read on, any relief David may have felt was fleeting when he gets back home to Ziklag, Philistine territory. What does he discover? David finds out that where he's been living has been attacked, overthrown, and burned by the Amalekites, other enemies of Israel, and the women and the children have been taken captive. So one crisis is averted in David's life, only to have another one arise. Been there before? Yeah. Well, David was right there as well. Now David's own people were talking about stoning him over what had happened. Read that in chapter 30. So he's got his own people turning against him. So two men in crisis. Now that's the big picture. Again, we covered a lot of territory there, I know. But if you got some time, read through chapters 26 through 30 and get the whole picture later today. But that should give you enough to see where I'm going. I want to drill down now in the lesson on a similarity between the two men in our story, Saul and David, once again. I think it's by God's design. No verse says this, but it seems like throughout this story, God keeps bringing up these two. This was the king Israel wanted. This was the king God wanted. Saul, David. God keeps bringing them up and contrasting them with one another. He puts them, if you will, in similar circumstances to teach a lesson. Both men find themselves in a difficult situation. Saul has the Philistine army knocking on his doorstep, and he's all alone, right? Prophets aren't helping him. God's not helping him anymore. That's Saul's crisis. David's got his own crisis now. His wives and children, and the wives and children of his own men have been taken captive, and the spoil has been taken, and the city's been burned, and now David's men want to stone him to death. Look at the words used, if you will, in both cases. This is Saul's crisis. 1 Samuel 17, the first part, or 1 Samuel 28, the first part of verse 12 says this. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed. For the Philistines in chapter 30 about David. Samuel 30, verse 6. That verse starts by saying that, moreover, David was greatly distressed. Same word, same phrase, exactly in the Hebrew language for both men. David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. So both men in distressing situations, but they end up this is the important thing, they end up by dealing with them in different ways, don't they? I believe this is perhaps what God by inspiration is trying to teach us here. Due to his own ongoing sin and rebellion, what does Saul do in his great distress? He turns to the occult. Saul has burned many of the bridges over which he might have sought help in other times in his life. And that's the problem with burning bridges, right? You can't cross back over. May not have seemed important at the time, but Saul has isolated himself to the point that he has to seek out help in the realm of the occult. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 15b through 19. Listen to the words, and you can hear the distress of Saul. And God has departed from me and no longer answers me, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you. This is calling Samuel back from the grave. That you should make known to me what I should do. Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? The Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me indeed. The Lord will give over the armies of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Well, that's bad news. You're Saul getting this news. Your distress has become even worse. Again, by the time you get to chapter 31, it takes place exactly as Samuel prophesies at this point. And that's that's Saul's way of dealing with it. But let's talk about David. How did he deal with his own distress? David has the benefit that Saul doesn't have. And I would remind you that Amalek comes up in both stories, right? Remember clear back in 1 Samuel 15, I believe it was, God told King Saul at that point, and that was really before things started falling apart for him. God says, go destroy the Amalekites. Saul didn't do it. That was the beginning of the end of his reign. So now, we've got the Amalekites back in the story. That's who David's dealing with. The Amalekites are who had raided David's city in Philistine territory. But in contrast to Saul, who has had to turn to the occult for any semblance of help, David turns in the right way. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. The ephod, of course, was just part of the high priest's dress. It was a Urim and Thummim as a part of that, and that was how Israel at times would seek God. Anyway, David's going through the right channels. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to them, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. Again, totally different. Same distress as far as the problems, but yet both men taking different approaches to who they called in the time of distress. Well, what do we learn from Saul and David's distress calls then? I believe that's what the lesson is there for you and I from these events that took place a long, long time ago. At least I hope there's some lessons. Let's look at a few of them. First of all, first lesson is that everyone experiences distress. Well, that's a love it news flash for you, right? You've lived long enough to know that. Distresses come our way. Everyone experiences them. And I just highlight that here because even David, the one who is God's choice for king, who God will eventually install as the king of Israel, that doesn't exempt David from the distressing times in life. Again, perhaps part of this is due from him making the choice to hide among the Philistines. That might be a consequence of all of this, but be that as it's may, everyone experiences it, sinner as well as saint. No one is exempt from the difficulties of life, but it's tempting to think otherwise, isn't it? Maybe in your distressing times of life as a Christian, you've been serving God, and it seems like you're going through a distressing time, and you look out at some non-believing, maybe friends or acquaintances you have, and it just seems like there's no troubles ever come to their life. We see it biblically in places. The psalmist pours out his or her heart in Psalm 73, verses 12 and 13. Listen to these words. Maybe you've been there. Psalm 73, 12 and 13. Behold, these are the wicked and always at ease. They have increased in wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. What's the psalmist saying? Well, look out there, and those who aren't even trying to follow God, who are living wickedly, they've always got it made. It's always easy for them. They're always increasing in wealth. But look at me. I've worked hard to keep my heart pure, washed my hands in innocence, and my troubles are piling up. Don't fall into that trap. But because that's what Satan wants us to think, right? Why are you trying so hard to live for God? You've got troubles just like everybody else. Jeremiah the prophet brings it up in Jeremiah 12, verse 1. Righteous are you, O Lord, that I would plead my case with you. Indeed, I would discuss matters of justice with you. Why has the way of the wicked prospered? Why are all those who deal in treachery at ease? So if you've ever felt that way, you're in good company, I guess. Jeremiah the prophet would agree with you at times. The psalmist would agree with you, but it's a false premise, you see. Everyone experiences distress. Those who follow God, those who don't. If that was the only measure of the blessings of following God, then maybe you'd have a point. But that's not the only thing viewed as a blessing. So don't fall into the trap of thinking, well, I'm the only one experiencing distress. Both Saul and David having their troubles in life. Secondly, don't sever lines of communication by ongoing sinful rebellion. Don't sever lines of communication by ongoing sinful rebellion. And that was Saul's problem, wasn't it? Right? God wasn't listening to Saul at this point in his life because Saul had made a choice and was sticking to it. Saul had chosen long before to do things his way and rebel against God, and that continued. And in that state, God says, I'm not listening to you anymore. David, though, hadn't severed those lines of communication. You see, a hardened heart effectively ties the hands of God, if you can imagine. God, well, he's all powerful. He can do anything he wants. Well, that's true. Anything in cohorts with his nature, but the only thing keeping God from answering Saul's pleas was Saul's hardened heart. Saul had cut himself off from the help he desperately needed. Don't be a Saul. Don't burn those bridges as we talked about. Instead, if you and I are maybe have become dangerously close to a hardened heart, don't be a Saul. Be rather that prodigal son or daughter who returns to their father, who is waiting for them with open arms to rescue them from their distress. That's part of the impressive story of that prodigal son in Luke 15, right? See, in Luke 15, the prodigal son was marching toward that point in life where he was cutting himself off from the love and protection of his father. But he came to his senses, didn't he? Let me read Luke 15, verses 14 through 20. You've heard the story, but it's good to hear it again. Now, when he had spent everything, speaking of this son who took his inheritance and went to a far country and was living it up. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed the swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. So he's so hungry, he would eat pig food if he could. But, verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, see, that's Saul's problem. He never came to his senses. This young man, though, came to his senses and said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? I will get up, and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. So he got up and came to his father. And of course, I love the picture of the father who has been standing perhaps every day, going out and looking at the horizon for that son to return. So he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Be careful about severing the lines of communication by our ongoing willingness to continue in sin, rebelling against God. God's under no obligation to answer our call at that point by our choice. Next, keep the lines of communication open by faith. Keep the lines of communication open by faith. This is in contrast to what we just talked about. You see, someone with a heart that hasn't been hardened against God, they may be going through the same struggles. David was still going through his own set of struggles, just like Saul. But yet David hadn't hardened his heart against God. He turns to God in his distress and faith. God answers him. Make God the first resort, not the last. See, God should be if you will, the last number on speed dial for us as believers. And sadly, sometimes we'll try everything to fix it before we involve God, and he's standing there like the prodigal son's father, waiting to welcome us home and offer help. God should be our first resort, not the last. This is what I want to reread what Finn read a while ago. Psalm 18, verses 1 through 6. And by the way, Psalm 18, verses 1 through 6, the heading of this psalm, it says, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this psalm in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, so Saul might have penned this very psalm, perhaps in this situation we've studied this morning. But here's the words again. I love you, verse 1, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of ungodliness terrified me. The cords of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. This is David's way of describing how desperately he was distressed. In my distress, though, verse 6 of Psalm 18, David says, I called upon the Lord, and I cried for help before him. And my cry for help, before him came into his ears. So keep those lines of communication open. If you wandered away from God, then you need to get closer. Keep those lines. Don't burn that bridge. Fourth, sometimes God's answer to your distress is to take you through it, not out of it. This is important to bear in mind because sometimes in our distress, in David's distress, guess what? He still was called to go out after the Amalekites, wasn't he? God didn't, on his own, go out and bring the women and children back to David. By faith, David acted upon the instructions of God. God's answer to his distress was, David, go after him, and I'll bless it. I thought of Mark 14, verses 35 and 36 in connection with this idea that God sometimes will take us through the fires of the distress instead of yanking us out of it. He did that, remember, to who? His own son. In Mark 14, Jesus has taken a few of his apostles into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's pouring out his heart to God and doing what? Father, take this away. Jesus knew he was facing the cross. He says, if there's any way this could be avoided, I want to avoid it. It's a funny sign. Verses 35 and 36 of Mark 14 says, going a little farther, he or Jesus fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. What was God's answer? I think Jesus probably knew it, but he says there in verse 36, he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. It was God's desire for Jesus to go through that distress to save the world. And you can be thankful for a Savior like that. God didn't exempt his own Son from this idea. We see the same thing referenced in the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. Let me remind you of what that writer says. Hebrews 5, 7 through 9 says, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayer and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. So what we just read about in Mark. Jesus, as we saw in Bible class this morning, agonized over this distress. Offered up prayers, petitions with fervent cries and tears. What does it say at the end of verse 7? It says God heard. Jesus, rather, was heard because of his reverent submission. So God heard Jesus' call to avoid it. But it goes on to say, verse 8, Son though he was, even though Jesus was God's only unique Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. Once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obeyed him. God's answer to Jesus' call was, you need to go through it to be the salvation of the world. Again, probably our prayers usually take the form of God, this thing is distressing me in my life. I want you to take it away. And sometimes God does. Sometimes God says, I'm going to be with you. We'll walk through this. Won't always be fun, be painful, but that's the way it works. Let's end this morning with a verse from Isaiah. We've been tying this all to, who you're going to call in times of trouble. In times of distress, who do we turn to? I want to encourage you with the words of this prophet, Isaiah 55, verse 6. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Perhaps what's implied there is the only time really for the faithful believer, the only time the Lord may not be found is if we again harden our hearts and continue on a path as we walk away from God. We need to remember God is there for those who seek him. God may be found, and he wants us to call upon him while he is near. Let me encourage you this week, if a distressing time comes up in your life, and it might, maybe you're in the midst of one right now, make your first call, if you will, to the Lord, because he desires to help his children. He desires to either take us out of that distress or walk with us through it. Either way, he's promised to be there. He's near. Any distance between us and God lays at our feet, not his. Think about that as we stand and encourage each other in songs.